Welcome to the Sports Entrepreneurs Podcast. I'm your host, Marcus Luhr, and today we're going into gaming and esports, and not just anything. We're going into big esports here with my guest calling in from Melbourne and down under, Chris Smith. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Hey, mate. Good to be here.
Yeah, I love the mate part. That is so Australian. And let me quickly introduce Chris a bit more to everyone who isn't as familiar with the world of esports and has come across this podcast, which is called Big Esports. Chris has been in this industry for about a decade on various roles, and we're going to dig a bit into this now in the first part of the conversation, and then we're really going to have a great discussion about the difference of esports and traditional sports and the revenue streams there. And Chris has some incredible data points there, which we'll dig into in very detail of the difference between revenue streams online and what gamers and streamers and of course other platforms in this ecosystem generate. So that's what this podcast really is about. It should be very highly educational. Chris is a true expert. You should check out his podcast too if you really want to go very deep. This one is going to be a little lighter, but very educational, I'm very sure. So but let's jump right in there, Chris. If I recall from our previous conversation, obviously gaming and esports is in your blood. That's your passion, and you turned your passion into a business or into a career. So let's get started. We always start a bit at the beginning, how it all started for you, and share that a bit with us.
Yeah, for sure, man. No worries at all. So, I've been around in, I guess, gaming and esports market for probably about 10 to 12 years now. But for me, I guess thinking right back to the start as a player, really, it's always been PC games for me. Got introduced to computers from my father at an early age, who took a real liking to it. So, I could say that maybe if I was destined to be a pro gamer, I'd probably have a pretty good story where I used to play Warcraft 2 on a 14.4K connection, dial-up connection as a 4-year-old against one of our friends from interstate. And across a body of water as well. So would have been a good story if I turned into a StarCraft 2 pro maybe, but wasn't quite to be. But, for me, my pathway into the industry is the same as so many who've been around as long as me or much longer, which is we started as a player. So I've played in top level teams in Australia in 3 different first-person shooter titles as a whole, 2 from the Battlefield franchise, so Battlefield 2 and then Bad Company 2, and then also in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, which is now a solid Tier 1 esport. But for me, playing in top 4, top 8 teams in Australia, just depending on the time and, what the game was and what year.
And you were doing that while you were going to school, or what sort of, give us a time frame here? Oh, that was
exactly.
After college, or...
Yeah, so I fell into esports kind of by accident, which is also, how so many people, my age or been around as long as I have did. So, I was playing Battlefield 2 throughout school through, year 9 and year 10. For us in Australia, that's around 16 years old in year 10. And then, wanted to kind of test myself and think about how I could become better. There was a thing in Battlefield 2, whenever you logged in, you could set a clan tag, and I had no idea what that was. And I remember seeing a guy was in a game with a clan tag on, and we used to play in the same server every single day, which was Internode Games on Net. Strike at Karkand was the map, 32 players on a 64-player size map. Right. Vehicles turned off, and they just asked him. His name was Cardiology because he was studying to be a doctor, and so his gaming name was Cardiology.
Okay.
And I just asked him, mate, what's a clan tag mean? How are you so good? And he kind of filled me in. And then the rest is history from there, and decided to become a better player. So I started taking things quite seriously in around year 11, and then kind of started my professional career, I guess you could say, as a volunteer commentator in around end of year 11, start of year 12. So they had about it was 17 or 18 was the minimum age requirement for that organization called Net Game Radio. And I started doing some Battlefield 2, some Counter-Strike source commentary, and just started taking more jobs within that space. And this is exactly why, we get a lot of messages on LinkedIn and Twitter, sometimes on Instagram, people saying, Chris, how do I get a job in this space? And usually I say, just pick one thing and stick with it. So, I started as a commentator, only commentating one game. And I said, hey guys, I started playing Counter-Strike. I noticed you guys don't commentate in there. And they said, well, Chris, if you want to do it, you can go do it. I said, okay. And then I said, hey, guys, I want to do video game reviews. This is when Flash games were huge on websites like Newgrounds and et cetera. And they said, well, Chris, if you want to do Flash game reviews, go and do it. So I did. And then I said, hey, I think it would be good. There's a lot of LAN parties that are happening. And a LAN party is when people bring physical computers together to play against each other in casual or competitive competition. Right. And Netgame Radio had some sponsors. I was like, hey, guys, we could probably increase our audience if we promoted LAN parties on our website and they promoted us, and maybe we gave them some of our sponsor prizes. And they said, well, Chris, same story. If you want to do it, go and do it. Right. And then when their marketing manager left, they did that as well. And that's what enabled me to start working with some more higher profile brands, and it would allow me to land my first job. But, it was really just taking those opportunities as you come. And, you find this, I guess you could say I started off as an intrapreneur, which is a word that I've heard of before, which is like an entrepreneur within a large organization. Right. And, you'll find that for most people listening to this podcast who aren't, I know there's a lot of senior people, but I'm sure there's some juniors as well that listen here, is that usually if you go to a business and you can make a case that, hey, this is worth it, this is worth our time doing. I promise it's not going to bring any negativity. I promise it's not going to lose us a bunch of money. Pretty much any boss is going to say, okay, go for it. And then you can just go build your own path from there.
Yeah, absolutely. No, great start. I love that. Now let's just have a look a bit around the different roles you've played or companies you work for. One comes to mind here is, I'm not sure if I pronounce it properly, Thermal Take.
Yes.
And, where you were sort of it was events management. You did, again, some esports community side of it. What exactly was that all about?
Yes, that was my first full-time professional job in the space. So when I was at Netgame Radio, we were working with a LAN party, and the manager of that LAN party came to me and said, hey, Chris, I'm the graphics designer at a distributor for a company called Thermaltake. They're launching a new peripheral brand into the industry, so keyboard, mouse, mousepad, headset in the gaming section. Currently, what they had at that time was only like computer cases and components to go inside the box on the floor, as some people call it, the hard drive. But he said, look, they came to me because I run some LAN parties. They want to run a $30,000 prize pool Call of Duty tournament, which turned into Counter-Strike after that. I got no idea. Please help me. Okay. And I said, because he was the only person who played video games at the distributor. So they just assumed, well, you run some events, you play video games, it's your job. And this still happens to this day in esports. I'm sure you know. I'm sure you've experienced this in sports and esports as well. Yeah. And I'm sure many listeners have too. So it was a trial by fire for me, but I ended up doing a really good job, almost getting fired from my IT traineeship for working, kind of bleeds over when you're on MSN Messenger trying to sort out, 32-team online tournament that goes to a LAN finals. And, $30,000 in 2010, that was my first professional year working as an IT trainee. I deferred uni to do a bit of a gap year, was going to do a Bachelor of Behavioral Science, minor in marketing, which obviously never eventuated. But yeah, it was a great trial by fire, and Thermaltake said, look, we'd like to bring someone on full time. We don't really have anyone that does marketing here. We need someone to support this new brand. So they offered me a job, and I moved interstate to work for them for 4 years in a community manager aspect, and it was fantastic. They gave me the room to, develop my own marketing strategies as a 19-year-old who had no idea what I was doing, and they didn't really know either. But, my salary wasn't that high because I was very junior. And the industry, was where it was. So I really got some room to, develop and learn all of those skills, and we're able to do things like be a semi-professional player at the same time while working. I went to Taiwan. I think it was somewhere between 4 and 6 times with that company. So I got an international experience with trade shows and sales conferences, et cetera. I got to, do shows like PAX Australia and EB Games Expo, and it really taught me a lot of the skills of, okay, there's something you don't know how to do, just go and find out how to do it. And that's some of the ways that I've mentored some people, and these days who come to me and say, Chris, I want you to help me as a mentor figure out how to run an esports tournament. And usually what I say to them, and I don't know if this is putting it too simplistic, is say, well, just write down everything you think you need. What is an esports tournament? What's the process of an esports tournament first? Okay, well, you need people to sign up for your tournament. So, well, there you go. Build a website, build a marketing strategy. How do people sign up? How do they pay? All right, that's step 1. Done. Right. What do they do next? And then you can just kind of build. You can kind of go through those and fact check your way through as you go.
You did that for about 3-4 years, and then what I see here is that pretty much right after you started your own agency, right? Chris Creative Collective, CCC here. How did that sort of, how did you were ready to jump out and go on your own, right? Because you were, then starting some of your own public speaking and events and other consulting side of it. Talk us through that a bit.
Yeah, so I finished up at Thermaltake at the end of 2014, and had actually applied for university as well. So I got accepted into Bachelor of Social Work with honours at RMIT in Melbourne. Another bit of a passion of mine, and my mother's a Master's of Social Work, so been quite exposed to that section. And I landed a job as a journalist throughout that time as well. I was working at first for a UK company called Technics, and then a US one called Tweaktown, just doing, basic news. So this motherboard released, here's the price, here's the features. Right. And then started doing some basic reviews of like smartphone accessories like battery packs, which are obviously very important back in 2014, not so much these days. Started doing audio and some things like that too, but then started picking up some of my own jobs on the side. So I ran a bunch of different online and physical campaigns with Gigabyte and Nvidia and Asus and AMD and Intel. I think I'm one of the few people who can say that I ran a marketing campaign through one Facebook page for both AMD and Intel at the same time, and still I don't even know how I pulled that off. But
nice one.
I managed to. So call me some sort of prophet or wizard, maybe, because anyone who's working in this industry knows they don't exactly like each other too much. Yep. So, for reasons, obviously they're direct competitors, but I did some things like that too that really enabled me to once again, I guess, grow in the space and learn a little bit more on both sides of the fence. So, usually when I am to explain to people where I am today, I've kind of sat on all six sides of the fence. If you were to run an esports tournament, which is a staple, kind of marketing exercise in this space, I've been there as the manager, as the pro player, as the consultant, the VIP. I've been there as the tournament operator. I've been there as the commentator. So I've been there in basically, every single angle you can think of.
Yeah, I love that.
A lot of that was my personal and professional development. Every time I thought I found the thing that I wanted to do forever. I thought I wanted to be the best player in the world. Decided, no, that's not for me. I was never a fantastic player, but I was always the one who would meld my team together, would keep people's energies up, would organize the scrims that we would play, scrims like practice matches, et cetera, et cetera. I thought I wanted to be the biggest and best commentator in the world. And I realized, no, too much travel, too much stress, and also too low of a ceiling. Then I thought I wanted to be director of marketing for a company like Thermaltake and later Corsair. But no, that wasn't the answer for me. I didn't want to be stuck to just one brand doing those kind of releases within one industry, and I thought I wanted to be the biggest and most well-known journalist in the world, and it turned out no, that's not for me. But it enabled me to gain that experience in all of those different areas that I can talk at least, within the past decade from personal experience with every single position within the market, except for, lawyer, I guess, CFO, but I kind of am as a startup owner now, and absolutely. Some of those other positions too.
And we'll come back. We'll obviously, dig a bit deeper into where you are now with big esports. But before we get there, just a couple more things here. One of the other things which I like in your CV here is, you're a board member and somewhat of a bit of a founder, I guess, as well, of the EGAA, the Esports Games Association Australia Limited. Bloody long word. So let's talk a bit about that. A is, of course, what the association does, and then B, let's frame a little bit for our international listeners here the esports and gaming world in Australia, right? I mean, I know it's grown dramatically. I've seen some numbers there on your from you as well. But talk us a bit through it, what you've seen there over the last decade.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so the EGA kind of came together because there's always that discussion. Anyone who's talked about esports with government, or anyone probably from sports who's thought about it, which is who's the governing body? Yep. So who's the controlling body of basketball? Pretty obvious. Football or soccer, pretty obvious. Yep. Cricket, pretty obvious depending on what country you're in. But within esports, it adds that extra. Issue, which is it's much more private. Right. So esports is created as often as a marketing ploy and quite often even as a loss leader, which is confirmed in my podcast with the head of electronics arts competitive gaming, that esports is often a loss leader for a public or private for-profit company. So, you don't need to pay the rights to anyone to just don a swimming cap, go to your local swimming pool, maybe pay $3 to get in, back in the day, or maybe $10 these days and swim, or just go to the ocean and swim. You don't really need to pay anyone for the rights to lace up your shoes and then go for a run on, at the local park. But if you're playing any game like League of Legends, even though it's free, you're still playing within their ecosystem. Right. You're subsequent to their rules. They're able to market you to purchase in-game items, and it adds that extra commerciality aspect. So that's why it becomes hard unless there's some kind of global governmental regulation, sometimes there is local, say like in Japan, to have a an overarching federation that will control esports. So what's the next best thing? The next best thing, from what I believe, is to create some sort of association which says, yes, we represent the best interests of the market, and the market agrees by joining us as members, and then we can go and talk on their behalf to people. But we can't tell anyone what to do. Correct. Because there's no way that little old you in Australia is going to be able to create a federation and then tell Blizzard in the US, owned by Tencent in China, like here's how it's going to go down, fellas. They're going to say no. There's not a chance. Like I'm not going to listen to you. So you need to have that. So that's the way that EGAA was created, is to kind of be an uplift of the community. So some things that happened, it was like a launch conference where we found that one of the issues was that a lot of these esports conferences, while any traditional business within sports or traditional business realms can afford a $200 to $2,000 ticket for a conference, esports companies simply can't. So that was one of the first things to do, was like, okay, can we make a few hundred person esports conference where the ticket is under $100? Right. That someone who's actually part of the market can afford to go along and can afford to learn about the latest things that are happening within the space and hear from mid to high level speakers without having to fork out. Because the cheapest conference in Australia besides that was Ashton Media's conference, which was extremely successful back in late 2018, 2019 time, and that was still $440. And if you think you're like an 18-year-old who's just founded your own esports org, you're probably not making any cash. You're probably putting your own cash into it and losing money. There's no way that you can afford a $440 ticket plus the flights and accommodation, let alone the others that are much more expensive. So that was some of the initiatives. The going at EGAA has been much slower than I would have liked, but unfortunately that's also what happens when you put together a lot of high-profile people who are all busy and then give them more work to do together without funding to do so. So, yeah.
Oh, interesting. And again, these type of associations are popping up everywhere here in Asia as well. And like you rightly said, it's the balancing act of how much power do they really have and what can they do. I know here in Asia they're trying to align themselves with the Olympic Council of Asia. So because in Asia, as you probably know, esports has now become let's say an official game in the Asian Games as well as in the Southeast Asian Games here. So there is a little more of an official status to it, and therefore this typical association structure which you have in normal sports or in traditional sports kind of falls in there a little better. But that's clearly not maybe what happens in the rest of the world, and so it's an interesting battle. I mean, even there are a couple of global associations, right? I think there's two, I believe, around the world, right? One out of Korea, and then I'm sure where the other one is from. But again, that doesn't mean the rest of the world all accepts them, right, and follows what they're saying either. It's an interesting struggle, which also will lead us later when we comparing traditional sports and esports in other ways. It's one of the big differences for sure. It's an interesting space there. Now let's talk a bit about what you're doing now, Big Esports, right? First of all, I love the name. And of course you have a podcast. Let's touch on that a bit, and then a little bit more about what are some of the roles and the work you guys are doing there. So when did you start your podcast? And and I said the word Big Esports really means you go really big and very deep into esports, right? You've had some incredible speakers in there or guests on there, and share a bit about that.
Yeah, for sure. So the Big Esports podcast, as with so many others, we kind of started being quite clinical when we started that podcast many years ago, and it was quite scripted. The questions were sent in advance and that kind of stuff. But over the period of time, it's devolved, but I think in a good way for how I like to create content. It is something a bit more casual, where we don't have any scripts. There's no pre-prepared questions except for a short talk before the guest comes on, and the topics have started becoming wider and wider. So it's been a great business driver for us, and that's where most of our content sits as. Right. We're quite prolific on LinkedIn, create a lot of content on there that serves as a business driver, with people seeing that content, resonating with it, understanding that we're a leader in that market, then reaching out to us to work with that. And we get probably about 75 to 80% of our business, I would say, directly through LinkedIn. And the podcast is part of that driver. It's also enabled us to talk with some fantastic people. I had the CEO of Atari on. I had the chief revenue officer of FaZe Clan, the world's biggest esports team, as they claim, and that would be biggest by social reach by far.
That's right.
the value of 240 plus mil.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And, they had their chief revenue officer who's come on twice now. I've had their ex-business development head, Clinton Sparks, come on, who's now leading another team. It's enabled me to interview the CEO of Atari, professional players. I'm a big Dota 2 fan. It's enabled me to have 2 ex-world champions, who've won the Dota 2 International come on. Peter PPD Dagger from, when he won it with EG, and also Loader when he won it with Alliance come on and talk as well. But we decided to relaunch it a little bit to be a little bit more casual and a little bit more wider focused. Esports is less than 1% of the entire games market globally, right? Being a $1 to $1.1 billion US industry, and games being, anywhere between 150 to 160, depending on who asks and when the report's done.
That's right.
So most of our work, even though we're called Big Esports, is really in the gaming space, because we find that esports is such a buzzword that most people most brands will come to me saying, Chris, I want to do esports. And you say, well, no, you don't. You actually want to do gaming, or you really want to do Gen Z millennials. Yes. And then the interface for them is gaming. And yes, esports can be involved in that, but usually esports isn't the biggest or all of what you want to do. And obviously it makes sense in some parts, because if you make high quality football boots, of course you want to work with Manchester United or someone like that to get your product in there. But if you've just created a social app, or not even just, or maybe you create a social app and you've got $1 billion in marketing, it might make sense for you at all to work with the Manchester United. It might make sense for you to spend $700 million of that into Google Ads and $300 million with influencers, and some of those being gaming, because gaming reaches the audience that you would like. Yep. So working with companies like that. Coming into the space, we follow that across with the podcast. So with the relaunch, our first podcast that we did was with Fusion Droid, a friend of mine who's a Minecraft YouTuber who lives here in Australia. At 22 years old, he bought a house, 4-bedroom house in cash off ad revenue money, and He doesn't even know how to write an invoice. So we had a fantastic chat with him. I'm a good friend of his, and I'm always trying to push him to be a little bit more business minded. And that's not his history, so that's fine. But
he's 22, so we'll just give him some time, I guess, and he'll get there.
Yeah, exactly, man. But he's working. As he said on the podcast, he works about 3 to 4 hours a day, 7 days a week. He produces about 8 videos a week that make him between $1,000 to $5,000 ad revenue per video. So if you do the maths off that, you take the average. This is in AUD because he works in AUD. Yeah. He's going to be earning about $1 million USD this year just of ad revenue alone. You wouldn't say without trying, but it's almost like without a plan. He's just doing what he does. There's no business plan here.
Yeah. And so that is, and we'll come to that later a bit more. These sort of, I know you have tons of these great examples there. When we come to the leading out of what comes out of your podcast and the leads you generated. So would you sort of describe it as mostly consulting to brands or anyone who obviously tries to get into the gaming esports business, to take it, to, as you said, target the Gen Zs, the millennials, and figure out how to get a slice of that $150 billion. Is that sort of the space you're in? Is that the best description, or how would you describe it?
Sure. I think, we're kind of almost developing more. I've got to figure out a better way to explain this, because I've already explained this twice today and here again on the podcast, but we're almost developing into like a VC, growth company that provides sweat equity and business development instead of capital. Okay. So there's a series of companies that we own that we're working with others on. There's one in the merchandising space, one in the raffle space. There's a series of other people's companies that we're working on. There's one that's in the content creation space. There's celebrity influencers. There's a few others as well, tournaments, etc. And then there's also other projects that we do on the side, which is some consultancy, influencer marketing, both in Australia and globally. Our own LinkedIn content, we're directly monetizing that now as well through 4 different advertisers right now. Sorry, 3, and trying to lock in a 4th, and some other parts of that too. So it is really a mixed bag, but it's the way that I met our partners, Playside Studios, was very similar to like what you were saying. So, Playside is Australia's largest independent games and app development company. They're listing on the ASX at the moment. I believe the article said that they were aiming for a $50 million AUD listing. And, once that listing's up, I guess we'll see what the final numbers are. But, they approached me on LinkedIn and said, hey, Chris, we've been following your content. We would like to find a way to become involved in esports and gaming. Competitive gaming. Obviously, they're in casual gaming. Can you come in for a chat? And they ended up paying me to do a 4-hour training session with them, talking about the market. And then they decided that they wanted to, work with me hands-on instead of doing something themselves.
Interesting. No, that's cool, and this is also a nice segue into what I want to talk about. But I do remember to see that we kind of didn't touch on the Australian landscape and how it's grown here. Let's go back there for a minute. Just talk us through how how would you compare Australia to the rest of the world? Right? I mean, you guys are always doing things a little different out there, but how does Australian esports or gaming connect to the rest of the world? In what sense? Do you have teams there who play globally, or you have your own sort of, most people just play within their own ecosystem there, or just give us a quick sense of the Australian landscape in esports.
It's the easiest way to explain is we're pretty much 10% of the US. Okay. So 10% being kind of like revenue numbers, I think we're roughly like 7% of population size, but over purchase a little bit more. We've got a higher, we've got higher disposable incomes and higher minimum wage and things like that too, in regards to our consumption. But if you look at a company like Corsair, which I worked with, becoming their first marketing employee or first employee in Australia, full stop on the ground. Corsair already had so much market share in every category without a single bit of marketing being Australia driven, just from global US marketing. We'd like to play the same games, League of Legends, Overwatch, CSGO, Call of Duty, FIFA. We like the same esports. CSGO is the strongest and most long-running, non-developer supported esport in Australia by far, and probably the number one esport really in Australia. Right. And, we've had some competitive international success with that. We've had our CSGO Vox Eminor boys, they were, turn into Renegades, turn into 100 Thieves and perform well. Renegades right now have another team they picked up, which is based in Australia, and have had some good performances overseas for that too. The issues come from location, essentially where the US in Asia. So some of the problem is that we don't play a lot of the same games as they do in Asia, so we can't practice against them. And because we're so physically removed, ping is a problem, which means that we can't actually play. You can't actually play competitively in Australia versus the US, and there's no way to fix that unless they make the speed of light go faster, because that's how packets travel. And how we need to play against them. So, often League of Legends teams here will go boot camp in Korea. Thankfully, League of Legends is shared across those. But if you're looking at say, Counter-Strike, which is one of our main games, that doesn't have a strong showing in Asia. So you're required to go, to other countries, which then creates that barrier, that physical barrier for us that's, it's expensive. There's also internet infrastructure problems here as well. But, there's quite a strong sporting culture in Australia, and one look at and it blows my mind every time I talk about it, but one look at the Australian Football League. We're a 24.5 million population here, and we've got our own code that doesn't exist in any other country essentially that can sell out 100,000 tickets for a finals. It's just absolutely nuts. So there's obviously capacity to grow.
Yeah, I mean there's a very competitive spirit, I think, in the average Aussie, and that is in traditional sports already. That kind of starts trickling into the younger generation, into esports. I think I have no doubt. Yeah. So you will have some world champions coming out of Australia in no time. And like I said, that you guys are mirroring a bit to the US market in sense is also not a bad thing, because that's where obviously a lot of the money is. It is interesting that you said that it doesn't really mirror the Asia Pacific region, which is very mobile driven now, right? As you know, it's really the mobile games is what's taking on this place by storm here, and PUBG and Mobile Legend, Bang Bang, and you name it, right? Free Fire are just killing it out here with massive numbers. And of course now, that's what I would argue what drives, at least here in Southeast Asia and to some degree in China, those big numbers there. So that's an interesting, good overview. So let's dig a bit into the part which, I'm really looking forward to, and that is comparing the real world of sports to, the esports and sometimes let's call it gaming world in a more general sense. And we touched on it already earlier with the first part, which is really who owns the IP, right? But, in the real world, it's federations, leagues, who have created these code, like what you guys called codes, around the world, whether it's FIFA here or it's the Premier League, who obviously manages and controls a large chunk of it. And in the gaming world, of course, it's publishers and developers who own it. That's the obvious, and I think that's we just touched on it earlier. Was there are federations, but they're really not in charge. Is there anything else we're missing here? Just talking about the IP ownership side of it. You got any other thoughts on that before we get into some of the other parts?
Yeah, the other main missing part, and this is partly due to federations not existing, and I guess But I don't have full knowledge on this either. But I remember watching an interesting YouTube documentary a while ago about how soccer or football in the US has been held back by federations fighting, even as of 100 years ago, and that trickle down effects from that. And it was a question as to if the US is so big and has so much money and so much sporting prowess, why don't they perform extremely well in soccer? And that was their answer. But the main and drawing the likeness between that and something within esports, the main thing is pathways. There's no clear pathway for anyone. So like I said, I accidentally got into esports and then I had to manually search where to go to. Right. There's a lot of high school leagues happening now around the world. There's a lot of collegiate leagues that are coming up. There's hundreds of colleges in the US that have collegiate leagues and dozens that actually have scholarships and full programs now as well with coaches. There's even, there's even 3 universities or 4 now in Australia that are taking things very seriously. 2 in Queensland that have their own facilities. RMIT in Melbourne, which also has its own facilities, and Murdoch, which is about to build some huge facilities with government funding over there in Perth. But there's still fragmentation that happens there. So, when I played, even as a boy growing up in a small town in Tasmania with, 23,000 people in Devonport, Tasmania, I knew that, I was a massive fan of cricket. I knew that I could play cricket with my school, then I could play for the local Colts, then I could try for the state, then I could try for the national team and then play internationally. But with esports, but with esports, there's no clear path. And sometimes that's the best thing possible because sometimes like the Australian Open, one of the biggest and best tennis tournaments in the world, they've run a fortnight tournament for the past 2 years. And a 15-year-old who plays on console and he plays on controller on PC called Brezzo, it's his gaming name. He came down from Queensland. No one's ever heard of him, and he won the tournament. He won like over 100 grand cash. Wow. No one ever heard of this kid before, but it was purely because of the merit of his skill. It wasn't through some selection process. It wasn't through anything else other than playing online qualifiers that enabled him to show his skills to come to the finals. And he beat players from Flashpoint Wolves, which have flown in from China. He beat players from NRG who were flown in, Benji Fishy, who performed high in the World Cup. He flew in from the UK. He beat FaZe Clan members from the US. This 15-year-old who you've never heard before. So sometimes it creates those fantastic stories. Imagine being a 15-year-old on stage. He looks shell-shocked, and you can see what you can think. Of course, why? Like he's won 100 grand, and he's 15, and he's probably never played a live esports tournament before either. And now he's in front of a crowd at the Australian Open, and on Twitch TV to hundreds of thousands of viewers. So,
and there've been younger ones who won more than that. What was the kid who won Fortnite? What was it? $3 million?
Yeah, like Booger. Won $3 million. There's
how old was he?
There's
he was
examples of
15 or 16 as well, right, or something.
Yeah, I believe something like 15. There's other examples of Samael, a Dota 2 player who, won a $1 million major with EG at like I think it was like 16 or 17. He'd won over $1 million personally in prize pool at the time he was 18 across multiple tournaments. He won the Dota 2 International, came second another time. Been a top player since he was kind of 16 years old. Just nuts. So sometimes there is positives, but ultimately, it's a lot of negatives because there's no clear cut pathway for people getting into the space. And there's also the confusion of what is esports as a performance versus what is esports as business. So we've started doing some work with the school here to help them develop an esports entrepreneurial base course, because basically all of these universities, by a very select few, say Staffordshire in the UK, they run an esports course at their university. It's all still performance based, and that's only one small part. The example that I use for people in Australia is like Sharon, who makes the footballs. They're a very different company to like the Richmond Football Club, and the high performance is very different to the science of Adidas making the actual boots for them to kick with or marketing the.
I totally agree. And we're doing some work in that as well. There's been quite a few conversations we had within countries where they saying, look, how do we build a college esports league? In the US, obviously, it started already. I'm trying to think of the company who is quite.
There's a ton. North American Collegiate League is probably the first one that comes to mind.
And obviously, and it's driven again by how traditional sports is very structured there as well in the colleges, in the university. So they pick that up as a no-brainer. But I do think the rest of the world is picking that up as well now and slowly seeing that you can do this as well. And there's again starting slowly a bit more of a career path for that. Of course, tying it in with studying in university side of things as well. So I'm sure that we both see a lot of those very interesting things there. Now the other part I'd love to, while we're still on the IP ownership here, is the leaks part. Okay, so and that is where I not all of them, of course, but some of the leaks again copy certain elements of of the American league structure, which is closed leagues, right? It's not an open system like you have. I think Australia is more similar to the Europeans, where there's relegation, right? You drop out if you don't perform. But obviously, there are these big league competitions where you buy yourself into with your team, right? So you buy a franchise the same way you buy a franchise in the NBA or the NFL, and therefore then you're allowed to play in these major tournaments. Now again, there's such a broad variation between all of them, from very little money to play maybe a league here in Thailand. Garena has Free Fire League here. Their Arena Velo League, I think, is a closed league here. So you get a little team here. You play. It doesn't have cost a lot of money to be in this, but of course you want to play at the big leagues. We're talking $10 million or even larger sums I've seen to buy yourself into. Share that a bit. Your knowledge in that space.
Yeah, for sure. Do you mean like in Australia specifically or globally?
Globally, yeah, in a big picture, globally.
Yeah, so I guess the easiest examples would be like the Overwatch World League, like a $30 million franchise spot, right. And similar with the Call of Duty League as well. But there's always questions around that. So, some of the first discussions I had with my partners when they employed me as a consultant first before joining forces with me was around from one of them. I'm just trying to think about exactly the best way to explain it. From one of them, he was saying, "Okay, Chris, so you've told me that games come and go. So, soccer or football, hundreds of years old. Right. Cricket, hundreds of years old. NFL, similar. But if you think about the oldest games in the market, CSGO, it's like, what is it, 10? League of Legends, 10? Or Counter-Strike as a whole, I think, is 20 years old. Not quite. League of Legends is 10 years old. Overwatch is what, 4 or 5? Pokemon Go, 4 or 5 years old. Obviously, Pokemon Go's not an esport, but even games as a whole,
right? A couple of years here.
Yeah. So if you think about the issue then, okay, if games come and go and I've got to pay $30 million to get into this gaming tournament, how long is it going to take me to make that money back, to make it worth my while? Also considering that esports is a $1.1 billion market globally.
Yeah.
So is spending 30 million plus operating costs in there going to make sense? So those are some of the questions that people continue to ask. And, we've seen with the Overwatch World League, the numbers have gone down season over season, but they have said they're releasing Overwatch 2. So it'll be interesting to see if they go back up with that. But, it's an interesting one. And, they've tried to combat some of the way esports has historically worked by making things, state-based or city-based as well. So you might have a Chicago-based team, an LA-based team, a London-based team, etc. There's London Spitfire,
right.
And it's Seoul Dynasty in Overwatch, etc. So they've also tried to do that to make people go with that pride of their locality. But yeah, it's been an interesting one. I'm still not I'm still not totally sold on the idea of having these franchise leagues and these closed leagues, but we've seen other people adopt those semi-closed capacities. So, the Riot Games Oceanic Pro League, which has since shut down in Australia, for quite a while, they did have that relegation style league where it's, the top 8 teams and maybe the bottom 1 or 2 drop out and the other ones come up. But then that became a semi-franchised where it was, okay, the teams that are in the top 8, you're now locked into here. And obviously it creates stability for brands. It creates the ability for, to build that marketing power as well, because what happens if you sell a brand, you're going, well, you have some poor performances and suddenly you're out of the tournament. Like that really sucks. And it doesn't build that stability in business or for marketing. But it also does come with those concerns that there is becoming that kind of professional gatekeeping, I guess, as part of that. And then relying on, that aspect of being able to scout new players and bring them up. And then also the costs that are associated. I see it almost like, if you're going to list publicly, what is it, about $1 million a year it costs you extra just to be listed? Right. So I see that almost as the same here with these franchise leagues. There are inherent benefits to being listed by being public and, more people know who you are and your information's out there and public people can invest in you. But there are also other downsides, which it costs $1 million a year extra in operations just to exist. Right. So you could say exactly the same thing about a franchise tournament. It provides you stability. It provides you that ins with the brand. It provides you with something that can be built over that long term. But also, it costs you, that $30 million franchise spot to get in there. So do they outweigh each other? And that's a business decision people need to make for themselves.
Definitely. And that leads nicely into a little bit, I want to talk about teams, the difference in teams, esports teams and pro sports teams. And let's quote Mark Cuban here, who I think is one of the more well-known ones, keeps saying, esports team is a bad investment. Now, as I said, there are obviously others who might have different opinions on it. and Team Liquid and Face Clan, I think very few people will argue that these are not great, well-run organizations, and obviously have abilities to generate some tremendous revenue, but also creating large valuations, right, in the hundreds of millions of dollars already, versus a smaller team somewhere else in the world. So, pro sports teams, I think we all know, they are the Man Uniteds and the Dallas Cowboys and the LA Lakers of the world, which are billions of dollars worth, grown over how many years, decades, in some cases. Saw statistics the other day that the average NBA team went from $300 million valuation to $2.1 billion over the last decade in 10 years. That's a nice growth if you own one of those, and of course one day can, either you sell it or goes, have that asset in your books there. Now, let's compare that to, as I said, the esports teams. Where do you see this going, and then we touch on, of course, a little bit already, the difference in league structures there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, I guess one of the main differences between a sports and an esports team is the rights. So, doing some studies on this for a Saudi client of ours that we're doing a feasibility study for, looking at the NFL and that earnings percentage versus, say, an esports team. The reports say that an esports team will gain around 70% plus of their earnings directly from sponsorship. Right. And a lot of smaller regions and non-US regions, that number is even higher. Where, often in Australia, it's 99% plus. Wow. One of the other main differences to clear up, and I've had this misconception from a few different investors, is that an esports team doesn't keep the majority or sometimes even any of the prize pool that flows through them as well. Really? So it's quite common for an esports team.
Goes straight to the players or?
Correct.
All right. Okay.
So it's quite common for a team to keep anywhere from 0, but more likely 10 to 25% of the prize pool going through to the players as well. Whereas I'm led to believe that if you have a horse, for example, you kind of employ the jockey, and it's the opposite. You might pay the jockey a bonus for winning, but ultimately it's your horse, it's your asset. Right. And you're hiring to ride that horse. Whereas an esports team, it's flipped the opposite way. So not only are you responsible for paying the salaries for these players, which are growing astronomically, the average starting wage for a LCS, or the average starting contract for an LCS player, so League of Legends Championship player, Championship Series player in the US in League of Legends, is $300,000 USD.
That's good.
Cloud9 have released, Cloud9 have released their CS:GO contracts. I believe they have about $6 million worth of contracts within that team now, which is buyouts plus salaries, not including any bonuses or increases year on year, of which there are to be some more as well. And, I believe it was Cloud9 that came out a couple of years ago and said, yes, we lose $1 million a year in our CSGO team, and now they pay them more. So the main difference in earnings, though, is that you're not reliant on those home ground or facilities. So, looking at some of these NFL teams, publicly traded, you can see that a lot of their earnings will actually come through ticket sales for their own games, will come through sponsors at their home ground. That simply doesn't exist for 99.9% of esports. Right. Some people are now developing their home grounds, as part of Call of Duty and Overwatch World League. The other major difference is rights. There's no, CBS, there's no ESPN, ESPN Plus massive deal with UFC. There's none of that that's coming down at all. So, the Overwatch World League did do a signing with Twitch in the past, which they relinquished. They went to YouTube, but that was part of a global deal with Blizzard. I think esports was potentially just an add-on to that. It was mainly about hosting servers with Google. So there's none of those rights are really coming down. So that is an advantage, if you're in a franchise league, if and when they become profitable, they'll obviously pass down some money to you as a team, but there's none of those big rights that are being earned. So the ways that these teams are innovating is they're operating essentially as an agency. So we're helping to broker a deal right now between an esports team in Australia and a headset partner. Okay. And the headphone partner is looking for the professional influence of the team, but they're also looking for influencer campaigns. They're looking for B2B sales support in regards to sales events. Yes. They're also looking for someone who can run tournaments for them. So essentially you're an agency that also owns an esports team. Very similar to Talon Esports, who we helped to raise $150K, I believe it was, as part of their seed round through an introduction through us. And had them on the podcast a few times as well. That's how they function as well. Talon creates media for their sponsors, not just for their own campaigns, but for their sponsors' campaigns too. So if a sponsor's launching a headset or a keyboard or a mouse, Logitech, which is one of their sponsors, they won't just create the content on their own, but they actually create content for Logitech to share. Or example of Kanga Esports in Australia, a team I've done a bit of work with, they're creating graphical and video assets for Atari right now for a launch. They are running booths at live events. They're doing media for other companies. They did an influencer campaign with them recently that had nothing to do with their esports team.
Yeah, I mean, if you see what FaZe Clan does, I think it's amazing, right? I mean, they are a bit like what you just described. I mean, they have obviously this massive fan following around the world, of the players they have on the team, but they are into everything, and a lot of the things they do, of course, turns quickly into gold because of that huge reach they have. And I think that's, again, a bit different than what you see when you look at traditional sports teams. Yes, they do have large followers, and on the back of it, they monetize it normally by building it into their packages. Right? So when I talk to Man United, it's clear they say, look, we got 1 billion followers globally of fans. We have in this region this many folks, and therefore here's how we can target it. But it's still more in a larger integrated sponsorship package where you kind of it's one line item somewhere in there. But I think esports teams are much more specific. Targeting teams there through streams, of course, and other ways, right? I think there's a different model to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and the other major thing, if you're thinking about who's making most of the money in the market right now, it seems to be the owners of content and the game developers.
Correct.
It's really hard to be a publisher or developer unless you've got billions of dollars. Compete with a Blizzard or EA or someone like that. Yep. I would believe that some of the smaller ones like PlaySide do well, which is probably why they're IPOing. They probably believe they do quite well, but besides that, it's the owners of the content. And if you look at FaZe, like you said, we were helping FaZe with a raise for a bit, so we have access to some of their numbers and can talk in generals. But the amount of money that they make from content is nothing to be sniffed at all. And if you look at the merchandise they're able to sell as well, yep. Jeff Pabs, the chief revenue officer, who has been on my podcast twice, he said they sold $1 million worth of champion merch in an hour. Right. They did a launch with Bear Brick, which are like quality collectible, almost like toys, like statues. They were $172 USD. They sold out in 26 seconds. They did $3 million worth of collab merch with Juice WRLD, a rapper that passed away. Yeah. And a few others too. They've now launched their own FaZe Studios to create content, and they've also partnered with and released their first full feature-length movie featuring only their talent. Yeah. In that movie as well, through their own streaming service and platform too. So it's really going towards that and the influencers as well, because you look at the amount of money that some of these influencers are earning, and with Fusion Droid, for example, that I said going to make over $1 million this year. He makes more money himself than any esports team does in Australia in revenue. Exactly. And I can guarantee that because I know how much they earn and how much he does. So if you compare that, he's 23 years old, he doesn't know how to write an invoice. You can see the power of these guys versus entire companies.
Exactly. And that's where we're heading. We're going to talk about the athlete and then, of course, the KOLs and influencers. But I have one last one here, which I need your input on. And that is the difference in real sports is that once you have there are rules and they're fairly well established over hundreds of years. They don't really change, right? They're minor tweaks, but it doesn't. But of course, that's not the same in games, right? The game developer actually does change the games to some degree, right? They try to, obviously constantly evolve it and that I've read articles, that is part of the challenge, right? You might be really good at this game, and then all of a sudden they change the rules on it, and all of a sudden you maybe not such a great player anymore. How do you see this? I mean, how does that affecting in a good and a bad way the ability for teams to really compete?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be that innovation, right? And it's part of what keeps the game interesting. Like, are you more talking about how do people deal with the fact that these games are changing, like fundamentally all the time?
Yeah, exactly. Right. And I mean, that's if you know how to play football, you know how to play football. You don't really have to keep learning the new rules every season, right? But in esports, obviously, you do have the developers changing the rules or changing parts of the game, right? Which means you are constantly learning, right?
Yeah, exactly. And that's part of what makes it exciting. Part of the hard thing is when games will disappear entirely. So, Call of Duty was quite a well-performing esport here in Australia. Right. But when Activision decided not to support the local market with local tournaments, the scene essentially died entirely here locally. It basically doesn't exist anymore at all, besides, sparse local small tournaments at max of $5,000-$10,000 prize pool. Right. But I think the advantage that does come with some of these games, and I really like the updating schedule of Dota 2. So Dota 2 is similar to League of Legends, a top-down multiplayer online battle arena MOBA game developed by Valve, and kind of League of Legends but harder, much harder to get into. Not necessarily a higher skill ceiling, but a higher entry level for people to get into. So thus it's a smaller game. But what they do is they go through what so many, even general app companies do these days, which is every 2 weeks they'll release a small update. And then every, 4 to 6 months, sometimes 8, sometimes 12, they'll release a major update.
Right.
And that changes what they call the meta in the game. So meta, kind of basically, within esports and gaming means, okay, here's the strategy that most people go for.
Right.
So the meta in a game like CSGO, if you're defending, might be to put 2 players A, 1 player mid, and 2 players B. Right. But maybe a fundamental change to the game of CSGO, which enables you to buy higher priced weapons earlier due to the change in the mechanics, right, or change in the map, might mean that actually you need to stack 3 people mid, 1A, 1B now. And it can make it exciting and reinvent the game for people. It can make these small tweaks. And obviously, by doing those small changes into big changes, there's not as many things that are broken either. Which is what used to happen in the past. Because you think about, if you release a Nintendo 64 game, that's it. There's no patches. There's no updates. Right. It's a lot of sleepless nights, I would say, for people trying to release a game like that. Whereas these days, it's not uncommon to have a 40 gigabyte patch on day 1 or day 1.5 after the first time that game is released, to be able to change it, to balance some things. And that's also what makes them so fantastic, that there isn't as much pushback against the rules. I always, I'm not a big follower of Australian rules football, but you can tell whenever there's a rule that's being proposed to be changed, because there's all, like, everyone's on fire on social media, all the journalists, everyone's going nuts. Some teams love it, some teams hate it, but sometimes it's good. It's almost good that you don't get a say in some of these gaming titles, and it does change that meta. And sometimes it makes you want to play more. Sometimes it makes you want to play less. Sometimes I loved the meta in Dota 2 for a while, where there was a roaming player, where they've got 3 lanes, and usually we'd play 1 middle, 2 top lane, 2 bottom. But then there was a meta for a while where you only have 1 person top lane and 1 person roaming all the time. And I love that meta. It made the game fast paced. But sometimes, they'll say, okay, the game's too fast. We need to give everyone more armor. We need to make everyone do less damage. We need to make items more expensive. And these small tweaks really keeps people on their toes all the time. When CSGO was my last competitive game, but when the beta came out, myself and my team, we spent tens, dozens of hours just walking around the map, just finding places. Can you boost here? Which means, like, can you boost someone up, stand on their head, and then get to a place that you probably shouldn't be able to get to? Right. Is there a skybox here? Which means that sometimes you can throw a grenade over a wall, sometimes you can't, because there's an artificial box that's placed in the sky there that's invisible, that you can't see. What are the best strategies to do? Where are the best angles to look from? Where are the best places to hold? And I think that's part of what makes it so exciting, that makes these special things you can do, because it's almost like it's almost like, being a cricket fan for a long time, there's no way that you can necessarily fully reinvent the game. You're always going to have people on the field. They're always going to be standing in certain positions. You're always going to have certain types of bats and create certain types of shots, bowl the same ball, and yes, you can be a leg spinner, an off spinner, a fast bowler, or a medium fast bowler, but they're still the same. But if you look at another sport that I love, which is mixed martial arts with UFC, there is also still, that's being reinvented all the time. The calf kick essentially didn't exist until the past couple of years, and now everyone's doing it with great success. For a while it was all about jiu-jitsu. That was the one thing, but everyone leveled out that playing field. So now they're looking at, like, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next advantage I can pull? And then going from there.
Yep. I can hear the gamer really coming through here. I love this. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that's how my team became good. We were essentially nobodies in Counter-Strike Source. A top 30 team. And then we instantly catapulted to being like a top 6 because we were nerds. We spent hours and hours and hours and hours studying the game. Yeah. We watched so much more footage than everyone else. We did so many more practice sessions than everyone else. We had a fundamental understanding of the game mechanics and the changes much better than everyone else, but we didn't have the personal skill and experience to back that up. Yeah. So, it's the same way you find fighters. Some fighters are just really tough, and they're able to get to the top 15 in the UFC just by taking a lot of hits, giving more and never giving up. Other fighters like Israel Adesanya are able to get there because he's just an absolute clinical technician on his feet, and he's just trained his kicks so well and he's distance managed it so well that he's able to get there. So that's part of the exciting thing for me too.
Yeah, I saw that when we launched Glory Kickboxing. It's the same thing when you sit close up and you watch the different fighters. It's incredible. But let's get into the athlete and the influencer part, because there is obviously a bit of a sort of not nearly a fine line. It sort of blends into each other, right? Pro gamers
Yep.
are obviously streamers, and that's different again than I would say in the real sports athletes. Sports athletes really, when you see them, is that on the weekend when they have the big match. That's sort of when you interact with them, right? Yes, they might have a Twitter account or Facebook or Instagram, and you can follow a little bit their, let's call it, lifestyle, and some obviously do a better job than others. Cristiano Ronaldo has 400 million followers globally, but many of them are literally disappear, and then they show up again. Whereas again, in the e-gaming or in the gaming world, it's a bit different, right? Yes, you have you have these competitions where you see them playing on the global stage, but they're out there every day streaming, like you said earlier. The example of he spent 3-4 hours doing things. So let's talk a bit about that, the big difference, and also some of the money involved in this for gamers and for the streamers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So one of the one of the things we talked about a little bit before, which was, brands would often come and say, hey, we want to get into esports. And usually the answer is no, you don't. You want to get into gaming, and you want to get into Gen Z millennials, and gaming is the interface and the way to talk to them. But there are still so many blurs between those two. And usually I like to explain the difference between esports and gaming as like sports and a leisure activity. So if you're just like kicking a football with mates, down at the beach, that's not sport, that's just a leisure activity. The same way that if your nephew is playing Fortnite on the iPad by themselves, your auntie is playing Candy Crush on the mobile, that's not esports, that's just gaming, which is a leisure activity. It becomes esports when it becomes structured competitive in nature. So I played a lot of mixed volleyball when I was a bit younger, 19, 20, 21-year-old playing with 40, 50-year-olds in a C grade league. You pay $5 per game to play. The winners might get some sort of little medal at the end. But it's still sport because you've got jerseys, you've got a team name, you're trying to win, and you're structured. There's a ladder, even though it's super casual. So similar with esports all the way up to professional competition, all the way up to Glory Kickboxing or the NFL Super Bowl. That's when it becomes sports. So looking at that too, though, there's so many blurs between those two. Esports athletes are often more so influencers than sports athletes. Like you said, how often do you see Cristiano Ronaldo pick up a phone and do a vlog and have a YouTube channel? He releases a vlog every week, talking about his training and his skills, and his hips feeling a bit tight, he's working that out. Here's my son and cool clothes that I bought for them thanks to the sponsor, for H&M for sending those through. You don't see that so much.
Not as much. Correct.
And it's the opposite now with influencers. If you compare that to movie stars, the example I use is, okay, what made a movie star so cool? Hugh Jackman, you see him once a year on the silver screen, maybe twice if you're lucky. Then he goes off into his Hollywood Hills mansion or wherever the hell he lives, and that's it. He's an enigma. You don't see him ever again besides that. He might make one Instagram post every 2 months, and that's about all you hear from them. Whereas now with these players and influencers, it's the opposite. You're in their life 24/7. Right. They're creating TikToks, they're streaming, they're creating YouTube videos, but most importantly, they're replying to fans and they're engaging with people. Yep. And this is where a lot of the monetization aspect comes in, with someone donating to Twitch or subscribing through payment to someone's Twitch channel while they're live streaming. Yep. It'll pop up. They'll get the ability to send a message to that streamer. The streamer may choose to reply to that and acknowledge that person exactly and say, hey, Marcus, thanks so much for joining. I'm so glad that you're here today. And you might ask a question. I'll answer that. How often do you get to ask Cristiano Ronaldo a question and he'll answer? Never. Exactly. So he's not as approachable. There's not Instagram stories where quite often Instagrammers will say, hey, ask me a question, I'm bored. Fusion Droid does it all the time. Yeah. You go to his Instagram and all his fans will ask him questions. He'll sit there and answer 20 of them. Yeah. And that'll just be, what's your favorite pizza? For him, Domino's vegan, vegan supreme pizza. He always eats that, and vegan garlic bread.
Because you asked that question before.
Yeah, like what kind of car do you have? Like a Subaru BRZ. What's your favorite character in Fortnite? All that kind of stuff. People will just ask those basic questions, but you get access.
I think it's that closeness which is now created, and like I said, you have a real deep look into it. And my son just shared with me the other day that he's a gamer too, so on Twitch he follows a couple of those guys, and he's not even watching them play anymore now. They're just watching a movie together, right? With Twitch obviously being part of Amazon. So if you have an Amazon account, they're streaming videos there or watching whatever, a movie together. And so there were 10,000 people watching the same movie together, but you had to have an Amazon account. So Amazon did a very clever job connecting, of course, their ownership in Twitch was promoting their Amazon Prime stuff. So again, I see there's all this amazing interaction and differences in how there's these influencers being used, and of course, then monetizing their side of it, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's all about that engagement. It's all about being accessible. So professional esports players still, they won't create a lot of content. Some of them will, but if you look at people who blur the lines really well, like FaZe Clan, as I said, their slogan is the world's largest, esports team, and respectfully, they're almost not even an esports team. Yep. Yeah, they've got a CS:GO roster and they've done fairly well with that, but if you look at their attention, you look at how many social media posts they make, it's all about their content creators. It's all about their influencers who, yes, they might play in Fortnite tournaments, but that's not necessarily their goal. Their goal is entertainment, essentially. And, that's where a lot of the teams who are making money are making that. And I think part of that is because you can only have so many people within the market that can win everything. You need more than that. You need, like Usain Bolt, yes, popular because fastest man and all that stuff, but there's only one fastest man. So who knows? Like, does anyone know who the second fastest is? Because I sure don't. Yeah. But if that person then has to diversify and create a lot of interesting content, maybe they have to be a lot funnier than he is. Maybe they have to be a lot more approachable. Maybe they have to create a lot more content. And he might be able to generate more followers than the person who's actually winning just by building those fans through being relatable and people building fans. It's not always the best UFC fighters that get the biggest following. Conor McGregor, the largest by far, by, 3x of any other fighter at minimum, is not the greatest fighter of all time. Yeah, he's held some belts, but he's also got some losses. And he lost to another fighter, Khabib, but I would say he's probably double as popular as Khabib.
He's the most interesting guy, that's for sure. Now I wanted to quickly talk a bit about the differences in these revenue streams, right? So you have subscription, on Twitch. I think it's $4.99 if you want to follow an influencer there. You have gifting, you have obviously the advertising dollars, which are shared. You have donation, which there's a little difference between donation and gifting. Give us some numbers, because I know you have a couple of those stats here of what people are making in this space.
Yeah, exactly. So, like an example I gave before, which is Fusion Droid, he talked about his numbers live on my podcast, saying he creates 6 to 8 videos a week. Works to 3 to 4 hours a day, 7 days a week, so figures out to be just under a full-time job. He'll earn 1 to 5,000 AUD in ad revenue per video. So that's anywhere from about $750 US to probably $4K USD per video. So if you crunch the numbers on that, he's extremely consistent. He pretty much will never release less than 5 videos a week. That's probably $1 million a year in ad revenue for him.
And his videos are what? Him playing, him talking, him doing what?
So he creates often story-based Minecraft content. So he plays in the game Minecraft, and he'll have a series of content. So they'll create their own little stories that'll follow on from each other. Right. And he has 2 channels as well. The second channel is about mods. So there's modifications you can do, but it's a bit too different from his main channel. So it's kind of the same way that a company might make a news channel and then a sports channel. He keeps those 2 bits of content separately. So if you look at that, on the podcast, he said about 95% of his earnings as a whole come from that ad revenue. Only 5% come from sponsorship. But he doesn't have a robust sponsorship sales nature. He doesn't have an agency that's actively going out there every day selling for him to put ad rolls on his videos, and he doesn't push that stuff very much, as well as he doesn't live stream, so he doesn't have those live donations.
He doesn't have the gifting and donation part of it, right? Okay, so because that's really linked to live streaming, obviously, where that's where the gifting and that side really comes in. And again, we talked about it earlier. It is a huge thing in China. Anyone in China in esports or in gaming knows that there's literally millions of dollars being generated through this gifting and or donation side of it, but it's only slowly picking up, right? So Twitch has it. I think there's 1 or 2 other platforms I saw they starting it as well, but it's in let's call it the Western world. It is still fairly new, right? Would that be correct?
Yeah, and I guess it really depends, because there are obviously lots of ways on Twitch for people to make money, like you were saying, through donations and such. There's other things like OnlyFans and Patreon where people are making a lot of money through now as well. There are initiatives on there are initiatives on YouTube now where people can actually have a paid subscription, or they call it Join, which gives you some of those extra benefits as well. But it's definitely not as robust as what you see with these kind of, it feels like unlimited streaming Asian apps or primarily Chinese apps, right? Where, they'll be live streaming to an audience. There won't be a theme. It won't be necessarily about gaming or whatever. It'll just be like, hey, talk to me. And then people will be paying for those stickers, for those gifts to give through to them. There's not that robust nature. But if you're thinking about like a live streamer, for example, like we've got an example of a streamer that we work with here a lot, from his earnings a few years ago, an Aussie, getting about 500 concurrent viewers on average. And this is someone he's very, very high earning for his bracket. So you would expect probably someone with 1,000 concurrent viewers to generally earn about as much as he does. But out of his earnings, this is not including ad revenue for him because it's not as big on something like Twitch, but he gains about 43% of his income from Twitch subscriptions and donations of bits through there. This isn't including donations. So if you're to look at subscriptions and bits together, just that version of fans giving him money is the same as regular sponsorship and one-off sponsorship combined. That's not including any of his donations or his ad revenue that he's getting through there as well. So it gives you, it gives you an idea as to the earning power of that. So with much less viewers as a whole on Twitch, they're so much more highly engaged. You can earn much more dollars as a whole through that because these people are donating and providing those experiences to, the top example, and I think he's the most subscribed to Twitch streamer right now, which is Nick Merckx. I think he announced he's got about 60,000 subscribers at his peak. Right. So if you do the maths, what you're saying before, that's 60,000 subscribers times $4.99 USD per subscriber. That's $299,400 USD. Twitch, as an average, will keep half of that or as a base. Obviously, if you're that big, you've got some negotiating power. But let's say worst case scenario, he's only getting the base level subscribers, which is $5. There are other tiers. You can do more. But let's say the worst case scenario, they're all only the base level and he hasn't negotiated a special deal. He's earning $149,700 a month just from subscriptions alone, USD.
Yeah, incredible. Yeah, and that's sort of what I really wanted to bring up in this podcast is, the numbers are, incredibly large for, young, in many cases, very young entrepreneurs in their own way, and young streamers and gamers there. And I think that's interesting. I think that's what I want people really to get their head around it. And it's not always just about the guys who have tens of thousands of followers or millions of them. As you said earlier, if you niche and if you have a strong little group there, but you're doing something unique for them, which they appreciate, there are ways to generate these revenue streams. And just to clarify, the difference between donation and gifting is really, donation is just cash up, where someone donates money, versus gifting is a gamified version of it, right? You get flowers, you get whatever, a hug, a kiss, or you can give them even a yacht or a condominium or something like this, and then that turns into cash, right? So there is a bit more of a fun element to it, and again, that's where I think in China this is so huge, and it's now picking up around the world, where this doesn't feel as much as you giving money per se, even though it has a monetary value, which then, as I said, the gamer or the influencer can then take these gifts and turn it into cash, which is then, of course, the interesting part for him there. So it's an amazing model there. But I want to talk a bit about what you just said about how that revenue is split, and we discussed that earlier a bit. Obviously we have our friends from Google and Apple here, who have these, large platforms, and they take a big chunk of any in-app purchases, right? Everyone who knows the space knows that it's 30%, which is what these guys are taking. So, and that means, it leaves 70% then for the platform and this, let's call it the influencer, the streamer, to share. And there's obviously been some controversy with Fortnite and Apple having a legal battle there. Just let's talk about that for a minute. What's happening there in this space?
Yeah, for sure. So, there's been a big big fight, I guess, between Epic Games kind of stamping their feet down, with their crazily successful Fortnite game and saying to Apple, no, we don't want to pay the 30% anymore. So, any transactions at all, straight off your total off the top need to be progressed through Apple, of which they take a 30% cut. So that's quite a lot of money, off the top. Right. If you're a game like Fortnite, doing, millions and millions of dollars profit a year, imagine how much more you could be doing. Tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars profit. Imagine how much more you could be doing with that 30% Apple going. So they've had a lawsuit fight against them for a while. I think Apple recently announced that if your app is making under $1 million, they'll lower it to 15%, but still hasn't fixed that, I guess, that entire thing. And, it's it's part of Epic Games' wider stance, I guess, because they created a competitor PC platform to Steam, which is often the place where people will talk but also play games with each other and purchase games, where they created their own Epic Games store, and they said as part of that they're going to take less of a cut. I believe it was 25% from Steam and a much smaller cut from the Epic Games store. So, they seem to kind of, as they say, practice what you preach, I guess, there in a sort of sense. But it's been an interesting discussion back and forward, as to, whether Apple should be allowed to do that or not and have that whole closed marketplace where if you have an iPhone, you need to use the App Store and you're part of that. That closed
and that
marketplace.
people will look at ways to go around it. It's an obvious, and so I do hope they will start lowering these numbers because I do think it will grow the ecosystem even more. That's my big belief, and of course I think we both have heard stories that they are looking at to reduce it, maybe even cutting it by half. And if they will do it, of course Google will have to follow too. And so it's been interesting space to watch for sure. Now. Well, I had last something which just came to my mind here earlier. I wanted to ask. I was kind of slipped my mind, but to sort of slowly wrap it up here. And there's so many more other pieces of this industry which we could talk about. The Twitches and YouTubes of how they make their money. Mix or failed, of course. So but we'll maybe have to cover that in another podcast here. You got Discord and you got all these other platforms which are really so gamer specific that if you're not in this space, you wouldn't have even heard of it. Right? I mean, my kids are only on Discord, and I literally had to sign up there to find them. So, they don't use WhatsApp, they don't use WeChat or any of those other platforms. So, it's a very unique environment and world where I think the gaming world lives. And if you as a brand want to target them, you have to figure out how to get there, right? I think that's that's obviously what you do with big esports. That's what we're doing with Total Esports here. Helping companies to get there and then find those, what you call Gen Zs and the millennials which are out there, right? So that's the fun part of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like it's a whole world that I guess you need your eyes open to, and I guess that's a lot of what I do and a lot of what you do as well, right? Is helping people to understand where to move in the market, and not everything that's in the news or in PR is often the best thing to do, and quite often it's not the best thing. It's because when talking to a lot of brands and investors, the only thing they're ever exposed to is the fact that esports teams exist. They don't, they can't make any other informed decisions because they simply don't know that these other things exist. They don't know really that streamers exist and how to get to them and how they're making money. They don't know any of these answers because the only things they see is the size of FaZe Clan, that Offset, the rappers, invested in them. They see that NBA players are buying esports teams and managing them, and all that kind of stuff. So they're just simply not exposed.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And as I keep learning every day here, from people like yourself and others, it's an incredible ecosystem, and it's very intertwined. I think I shared with you before, one of the things we're doing now, we're bringing third-party IP from whether it's a famous football team or it's a Hollywood superstar. We bring them into into games now. Right? So we work with some of the game developers to drop these IPs in there as in-game purchase, which that's where especially the mobile games, that's how they make their money. Right? It's not a subscription model, and that money can be huge if you have big IP. I just saw Conor McGregor was dropping into this sort of game out of it's a small developer out of Eastern Europe who did a deal with him. Of course, you see PUBG's done deals with was a Blackpink, big K-pop brand group out of Korea. So you see all those groups now doing those cross fertilizations, right? What I would call co-branding, basically, right? Where you take something which is already a large established brand and then dropping it into your own platform, right? And I love these collaborations there, and it basically does the same trick, right? It drives the brand. It obviously makes the game more interesting, and the brand which drops in gets that exposure to that audience too, right? So both sides win, both sides make money with it. And you have any other interesting example on that? Anything you may have been involved in or you've seen which really stands out in that space?
Yeah, there's so many more examples of that happening now where professional athletes and influencers are looking towards their future and looking to gain equity in things. So one example would be, I guess, FaZe Clan that we talked about before. They have an equity-based relationship with the meal replacement company. They're providing marketing, in regards for equity, essentially. You're seeing that with people like Conor McGregor with his own game. We're working with some athletes, bringing them to become content creators themselves and a natural progression into the space. You're seeing influencers release their their own apps. Playside doing the Keep It Cleaner app, a fitness-based, female-focused app, Bloom, a meditation-based app that are doing very well in their own right. And you're seeing that with so many more influencers around the world too. You're seeing maps from people like Dr. Disrespect created his own map, who's a famous streamer in a game called Rogue Company from High Res Studios, and seeing things like that too. So, people are really just trying to set up their future by having ownership in companies.
Yeah, and I just saw the other day, actually, I think it's Mobile Legends Bang Bang, with a big mobile game here in Asia. They did a deal with Manny Pacquiao just for the Philippines. So you have Pacquiao now as an avatar in the game,
Cool.
So again, all those things are happening, and Manny Pacquiao, of course, is already a global star, and I'm sure they will use him globally as well. But they launched it, of course, in the Philippines, which is the home market, and you can imagine how huge that will be there, right? The influence, the attention that will get, and people driving towards it, and of course you don't get them for free, right? If you want to play as Mr. Pacquiao there, you have to pay for it. That's obviously how the games make their money, and that's sort of what we said earlier already. It's clearly the publishers and developers are making a large chunk of that revenue, and it's for all the right reasons there. So, Chris, this has been fun. I think we've covered a huge ground here. Hopefully, everyone who was listening learned a few things here and there, and either we confused the hell out of them or made them a little smarter, that's for sure. And I learned a few things as well. So thanks for your time there. I'm sure we're going to do a bit more of that, as we're already discussing a few potential collaboration on some ideas we've had. So I look forward to doing that a bit more often with you.
Yeah, no worries at all, man. Happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So all the best there in Melbourne, and we'll talk some more soon.
Thanks, man.
Cheers.
The Sports Entrepreneurs by Marcus Luer podcasts are a collection of interviews and stories. All content in this podcast is the copyright of Marcus Luer. Reproduction and distribution of the presentation without written permission of the owner is prohibited. All rights reserved.